the ocean, Earth's majestic blue heart, pulsing with life and mystery. But as we draw closer, a grim reality emerges. This isn't just water and marine life. It's a soup of plastic and pollutants. Our cities, our industries, our very way of life, all culprits in this growing catastrophe. From the distant factories to the urban sprawl, from our very homes to careless maritime operations, we unknowingly dispatch millions of tons of waste into our ocean's embrace. But it's not just marine life that pays the price. Our oceans are the lifeblood of our planet, regulating our climate, providing sustenance and livelihood to billions, and playing a central role in our global ecosystem. As we jeopardise the health of our oceans, we endanger the very benefits they give us: the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the balance of life on Earth.
So there's different forms of pollution in the ocean. Pollution can come from ships, it can come from deliberate dumping of waste, it can come from land, and even atmospheric pollution in the ocean. So the high seas belongs to no country, so it's the international community that's responsible. And mostly in terms of law and policy, it's adopted through the United Nations.
Chemical pollution in the ocean has been a growing issue since the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. With this period of rapid industrialisation came an influx of chemical waste with no safe disposal options. The widespread belief that the ocean would solve the problem of pollution by diluting chemical waste, meaning that the ocean became one of the primary dumping grounds for personal and industrial waste throughout the Industrial Revolution and beyond. Although we now know better, these legacy chemical contaminants still persist in our ocean today. And together with emerging chemical contaminants and heavy metal pollutants, continue to pose a threat to marine ecosystems and those who rely on them. These contaminants enter our ocean through several pathways. Ocean-based sources, such as discharge from marine shipping, offshore industrial operations, and waste disposal at sea, accounting for roughly 20% of all ocean pollution. The remaining 80% comes from land-based sources, such as agricultural runoff, river and estuaries, the atmosphere, and direct discharge into the ocean.
But where it gets worse is when you're looking at contamination, and it's just chemical. You start doing chemical analysis on these things and you find that pretty much all of them are contaminated with multiple man-made chemicals. You can measure the radioisotope from that disaster and how quickly it sinks, and more recently they did it with the cesium-137 from Fukushima, and they were calculating it to be something in the region of about 60 metres a day. And so to get to the deep sea, you're looking at a couple of days if you're taking the 200 metres as the start of the deep sea.
About 65% of all plastic material floats in the ocean. So most plastics will float and then they can be transported by ocean surface currents. But if they protrude a lot from the ocean surface, they can also be transported by wind. And then waves can also influence how they move. And then obviously if you have plastics that sink, they'll sink to the ocean floor and they might be transported a bit by ocean bottom currents, but they generally won't move as far away from where they entered the ocean as floating plastics will.
When we take a ship, for example, a couple of years ago we went from Guam to North Australia and we've sailed through Indonesia, and the level of floating plastic objects on the surface was horrifying.
Mainland Western Australia, we have this pretty strong current flowing from north to south along the coast, which is called the Lewin Current, and that kind of acts as a protection. So essentially if you imagine a highway, it's really hard to cross the highway, but it's quite easy to flow with it. So the same kind of happens with plastics that come from the ocean, so not from Western Australia itself, but from the open ocean. They'll tend to flow with the Lewin Current around the south coast, and they won't really cross the current and end up on the shore. So that's one of the reasons I think why Western Australia is relatively clean on the beaches.
We looked at microplastics in the guts and found that even in the bottom of the Mariana Trench, every single animal had at least one piece of plastic in its gut.
One of the big things is that marine animals can eat plastics. So seabirds, for example, are especially prone to that, and sea turtles as well. So this isn't really a problem as long as the plastics are small enough and they can pass through an animal's digestive tract. But if they're too big, which is often the case for seabirds, they'll fill up their stomachs and they'll lead to starvation.
Not only this, plastic pollution adversely impacts fisheries, aquaculture, recreation, and overall global health, causing up to a 5% decrease in the advantages humans gain from the ocean, translating into an ecosystem value loss of up to $2.5 trillion annually. Our very health is also under siege. The air we breathe, the water we depend on, and the soil that feeds us, all tainted. A harrowing study unveiled that 93% of bottled water across 9 countries and 11 brands contain microplastic contaminants. Our future is at a tipping point, and the clock is ticking.
At the international level, so through the United Nations, which is really all member states, all countries that are members of the United Nations coming together, and they have joint responsibility to cooperate and work together to protect the oceans. In relation to state waters, so the first 200 nautical miles off the coast of any country, it's the coastal state that has some responsibilities. And then flag state, which is the states where vessels are registered, have some responsibilities, and so too do port states, where ships, for example, come back into port. So because the oceans are all connected, it's really important that coastal states, port states, and states where vessels are flagged all take responsibility for human activities in the ocean which might cause pollution. The difficulty at the moment is there is no actual treaty in place for the clean-up or the prevention of plastics in the ocean, and in 2022 the United Nations Environment Assembly agreed to start negotiating a new treaty. 175 countries in the world agreed to that. So they're part way through that process with the hope of having a new agreement available by the end of next year.
Not all hope is lost though, because many are taking action. The Ocean Cleanup is a foundation doing its part, creating innovative technology to remove legacy plastic from the ocean's surface, while stemming it at the source of river mouths and collecting it before its impact can be felt on the ocean. It aims to remove 90% of floating ocean plastic by 2040 and is tracking towards this, having removed 5,500 tonnes so far. Then there's UWA, a biotech company located here in Perth, turning seaweed into recyclable and biodegradable plastic alternatives that not only tackles plastic pollution, but is mitigating climate change and restoring ocean health. Seaweed is farmed and harvested in Indonesia, then brought back to the lab to be fermented and melted into pellets that can be extruded into any plastic form.
That have learned to chew up long molecules in nature. And since we started putting plastic into the environment since the 50s, they also partially learned to chew up plastic molecules. And they do that with so-called enzymes that are just molecular scissors. And this is how an enzyme looks like, and so it would chop up the plastic molecule into single bits. Individually, everybody can reduce the amount of plastic they consume. So when you go to the supermarket, you can, buy a salad, for example, that is not packed in plastic, whereas you can leave behind the tomatoes that are wrapped in packaging. So that's an individual choice if you have. We started phase 1 of the plastic phase-out in Western Australia, which means that a lot of single-use plastic items such as forks, cutlery, plates, and all these things are not found in supermarket shelves anymore. So that's great, and I'm really pleased. And phase 2 is coming through. Change, we need systems that contain plastic better. So this is not down to individuals when plastic is actually leaking into the environment very often. It comes down to landfills, other problems in the system. So there's a lot of change happening, a lot of regulation, a lot of system change happening, which makes me really positive, and we need to keep demanding for more. And we also need to raise awareness what we can do individually, but I think we're on a good way of tackling plastic.
On an individual level, we can cut down on our single-use plastic, ensure that we recycle them properly, support legislation to curb plastic production and waste, wear sunscreen that is marked reef safe, choose non-toxic household items, and if they are toxic, dispose of them properly. We can use less water so there is less excess runoff and wastewater flowing into our oceans. If each and every person took these steps, pollution in our ocean can be massively decreased. The challenges of ocean pollution are vast and complex, much like the oceans themselves. But amid this stark reality, there are pockets of progress. While every hand that cleans and every sustainable choice we make may seem insignificant, collectively, they signify a cautious optimism. As communities globally grapple with the consequences of our past, a nuanced understanding is emerging. The road ahead is long and uncertain, but with knowledge, action, and reflection, we inch closer to a balance.